After 40 plus years, a resurgence of the Son of Sam case ensued following the release of the docuseries Sons of Sam, A Descent into Darkness, which examines the theories of investigative journalist Maury Terry. The case was closed by NYPD after David Berkowitz officially confessed in court and pled guilty on May 8, 1978. He was sentenced to 365 years. Over the last 4 decades, many theories have been presented as to how a seemingly normal and nice guy could commit such heinous crimes. From Harvey the barking dog who possessed Berkowitz to international cults and conspiracies of all sorts, the energy of this case just will not subside. Due to the fact that NYPD, quote-unquote, got their man and it did not go to trial, the case discovery is limited, though recently many official documents were uncovered that just may bring us back full circle regarding our personal thoughts and theories on the Son of Sam. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Cracklin' Rosie True Crime. Today we are digging deep into the People versus David Berkowitz data dump, and we will be looking at law enforcement statements prepared pretty much September and October 1977 that were turned in to the DA's office. So we're going to be looking specifically at law enforcement members who handled and transported David Berkowitz the night of his arrest. So let's get started. Thank you for being with me. Before we dive heavy into the reports, I'd like to just give a quick shout out to the SOS Timeline Task Force. Our backdrop is taken proudly from our slideshow, which will be available in the next few days. Let's dive in. September 6, 1977. Detective John Filotico, number 1341, 10th Homicide Zone. Telephone number redacted. On August 10, 1977, at about 10 p.m., David Berkowitz was detained while sitting in his car after exiting, and it's redacted, it's the Pine Street address. Detective Filotico identified himself as a police officer, and Berkowitz responded quickly to each command made by the police. Berkowitz says nothing at all. He was calm and responsive. Detective Filotico says to Berkowitz, "Now I have you. Who do I have?" And Berkowitz responded, "You know." Berkowitz, in Detective Filotico's presence, is transported to the Yonkers Police Department. Detective Higgins advised Berkowitz of his rights, and he responded after each one. Craig Glassman, who was in the car, asked Berkowitz if he knew him, and Berkowitz stated, "You're Craig." At the Yonkers Police Department, Inspector Dowd was present, and Berkowitz recognized him when Dowd asked him if he knew him. Dowd and Berkowitz spent 3 to 5 minutes alone talking. Detective Filotico was not part of the conversation. In the Yonkers Police Department station, Detective Shelensky of the New York Police Department Legal Bureau reread Berkowitz his rights, and he responded after being asked if he understood each one. Present in the room is Inspector Dowd, Chief Keenan, Detective Shelensky, Detective Filotico, Captain Jones, and Lieutenant Neese, both of the Yonkers Police Department. Inspector Dowd questioned Berkowitz for approximately 45 minutes with the aforementioned people present. During this interview, Berkowitz was calm, collective, intelligent, and willing to answer. His answers were spontaneous. So he wasn't looking, making up, he came right out. I mean, I love watching interrogations, and what's really cool is when someone walks in like, oh, I don't know anything, and then watching the techniques of the detectives, and then by the end, they're like spilling their guts. Berkowitz came in, and even though these reports are later, this is what was provided to the DA's office, they're going through their notes and compiling this report and then turning it in. So these are happenings the night of. He was calm, he was collective, and he was giving spontaneous answers. He was there confessing. Now, where the heck was I? Okay. Also, he corrected Inspector Dowd if there were factual errors in his questions. The defendant was offered food or the use of a bathroom, but declined. After Inspector Dowd's interview, Detective Filotico interviewed the defendant about the Moskowitz homicide. Berkowitz again kept his same demeanor as noted above. This interview lasted for approximately 5 minutes. So far we look like he was questioned about 45 minutes by Inspector Dowd and then an additional 5 minutes by Detective Filotico. Berkowitz was then charged formally with homicide, and he made no response when told. Detective Filotico continued to stay with Berkowitz until leaving the Yonkers Police Department to go to police headquarters in New York. Nothing of consequence took place. In the car ride to police headquarters was Detective Zigo, Captain Coleman of the 10th Homicide Zone, Berkowitz, Sergeant Gardella, and Detective Filotico. Most of the conversation was not related to the homicides, but of a general nature. Berkowitz responded and participated in these conversations with Detective Filotico and/or Detective Zigo. Detective Filotico informed the defendant that at police headquarters there may be some excitement because reporters would be present. So we all know that scene, what that was like. They were just kind of prepping him for it. I think they were talking about, kind of staying in between in case somebody took a pot shot at him, or reporters are going to be all over. There are going to be people, and I should include, if I can, I'll include a little clip of that scene at the end of this video or on the next one. All right, back to business here. Where was I? Okay. Berkowitz was concerned that his hair was messed up. Detectives Filotico and Zigo combed Berkowitz's hair. He was concerned that after Filotico finished one side of his head, that the other side wasn't combed. Therefore, Zigo finished it up. His demeanor was the same as noted earlier, no change. He wanted his hair nice, though. And man, the cops combed his hair. I would have been like, pfft. Anyway, that was nice of them, no? At police headquarters in New York, there was no conversation with Detective Filotico and Berkowitz. After taking him to the 13th floor conference room, Berkowitz was then guarded by Sergeant Allison from police headquarters to the 84th precinct, and at the 84th precinct, the only conversation with the defendant was when Filotico asked him at the 84th precinct if he wanted to make a phone call. Berkowitz placed a call to his sister himself, but she wasn't home. That was Roz. From the 84th precinct to 120 Skimmerhorn Street, Detective Filotico says he did not speak to the defendant. And after leaving the car, he has no more direct contact with him. Other police officers lodged him. So that was Filotico's account of transporting Berkowitz to YPD and then to police headquarters. We are going to jump into the account of Detective James Fox now. Remember, a few weeks ago, we covered the DA's questioning in Brooklyn of Berkowitz. So these are all of the happenings and the movement of Berkowitz prior to that. Statement dated September 2nd, 1977. Detective James Fox, Shield number 2558, assigned to the Major Case Squad, telephone number redacted, with David Berkowitz from 1 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. on 8/11/1977. On August 10, 1977, Detective Fox was assigned to the Homicide Task Force and was with Detective Gleason of the Kings County District Attorney's Squad and Detective Hugh O'Donnell from the Queens Robbery Squad. At 1 a.m., he responded to the Chief of Detective's office at New York Police Department headquarters on the 13th floor. He was assigned by Captain Borelli to watch the defendant, who was seated in the conference room. Detective Fox and the defendant had a brief conversation. Detective Fox asked the defendant where he was, and the defendant knew he was at police headquarters. The defendant answered only when questioned. The conversation that took place was of general nature, i.e., about going to the bathroom. The defendant appeared calm. The defendant was asked if he knew why he was here at police headquarters and responded yes. He was informed by Detective Fox they were going to Brooklyn. The defendant requested to go to the bathroom a couple of times. Detective Fox did not go with the defendant to the 84th Precinct, but met him there. At the 84th Precinct, during the booking process, the defendant was asked pedigree questions, which he answered spontaneously. Philip Peltz was brought in. Detective Fox told the defendant that he, Peltz, was a lawyer. The defendant wanted to know who hired him. The defendant agreed to speak with Peltz, and Peltz gave the defendant his card, which the defendant saved. After Peltz left, Detective Fox explained to the defendant what was going to happen at the arraignment. The defendant answered he understood what Detective Fox was telling him. The arraignment was held, and the defendant was turned over to the Department of Corrections at 12:15 p.m. Detective Fox stated that the defendant told him in response to a question put to him earlier in the evening he was under no medication. Detective Fox stated the defendant was alert and calm during the entire process, except at the arraignment when he was shaking. No notes were made by Detective Fox. So he got a little nervous at the arraignment, and that was pretty short, considering he spent a pretty long time watching Burke before being transported again. That was relatively short. So what I will be doing after we go through a few of these for another video, I'll go back and start rereading some of the loose notes and see if there's anything that gives us a little bit more detail. So let me jump into Sergeant William Allison. So this report is dated September 2nd, also 1977. Sergeant William Allison, Shield number 413, assigned to the Intelligence Division, telephone number redacted, with David Berkowitz from 1:15 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. on 8/11/1977. On August 10, 1977, Sergeant Allison was assigned to the Homicide Task Force from 4 p.m. to 1 a.m. as a supervisor of detectives. At 12:30 a.m. on August 11, 1977, he was directed by Inspector Dowd to the New York Police Department Police Headquarters in Manhattan. At this time, he saw David Berkowitz for the first time. Subsequently, he was instructed by Captain Borelli to stay with the defendant until the end of the initial court proceedings. This took place in the Chief of Detectives' office, where the defendant was seated in the conference room. Sergeant Allison went over to the defendant, who was seated, and introduced himself to the defendant. the defendant identified himself to Sergeant Allison. Detective James Fox, shield number 2558, was also present. Sergeant Allison recalls the time to be 1:15 a.m. when he started this assignment. Until 3:30 a.m., Detective Fox and Sergeant Allison watched the defendant exclusively. Sergeant Allison started to engage in small talk with the defendant during this time and did not conduct an interview. Most of the conversation centered around how the defendant felt and if he wanted anything to drink. So it sounds like they treated him fairly. At no time were any complaints or requests made by the defendant. The defendant acknowledged verbally he felt all right and gave Sergeant Allison his address when asked it. Sergeant Allison recalls the defendant's appearance was calm, cool, and coherent, and it appeared he understood the basic questions put to him. The defendant did not hesitate when making a response to any question put to him. The defendant was aware he was at police headquarters, and he recognized Captain Borelli based upon seeing a picture of him in the newspaper. The defendant would speak only when spoken to and did not volunteer any information. When approached by other officers in the conference room, the defendant was cooperative. Sergeant Allison indicated at one time after joining the defendant, he asked the defendant if he received his rights, and his reply was yes. During the time the defendant was with Sergeant Allison, it appeared the defendant knew what was going on. At 3:30 a.m., the defendant was interrogated formally by the various district attorney's offices. After the statements were taken, Sergeant Allison, Detective Fox, and the defendant were together again. The defendant requested to go to the bathroom and was taken and thanked Sergeant Allison for any courtesies, i.e. a drink of water. Prior to leaving the Chief of Detective's office, the defendant requested an opportunity to wash up. Clean David. The defendant was taken from police headquarters to the 84th Precinct Central Booking. The defendant's calm demeanor did not change. At the 84th Precinct, the booking process was explained to him, and he remained cooperative and seemed to understand the process. At the 84th Precinct, Sergeant Allison left the defendant for a short period of time, 2 minutes, but Detective Fox remained with him. The defendant was offered coffee at this time, and he refused. After the 84th Precinct booking, the defendant was removed to the criminal court building at 120 Skimmerhorn Street. If there was any conversation in the vehicle, Sergeant Allison can't recall it. At 120 Skimmerhorn Street, when the defendant was placed in a cell and eventually a detective pen, where the defendant was placed in a cell and eventually a detention pen. Sergeant Allison was with him with Detective Fox. Again, there was small talk between Sergeant Allison and the defendant. There was no conversation between the defendant and the correction officers at this point. They weren't having any chit-chat with Burke. Coffee was provided to the defendant by Captain Dagan of the New York Police Department, and the defendant smiled and thanked him. Pretrial services interviewed the defendant for 10 to 15 minutes, and it appeared the defendant answered the questions as they were put to him. Philip Peltz was admitted to see the defendant after introducing himself as the defendant's lawyer. Sergeant Allison asked the defendant if he wanted to speak to Peltz after being told he was a lawyer. The defendant agreed to speak to him for now. A 10 to 15 minute conversation between Peltz and the defendant took place. This was the only time the defendant changed his demeanor to one of being annoyed. After Peltz left, Sergeant Allison explained to the defendant the security precautions to be taken and instructed him what to do if something happens. The defendant responded, okay, and would do exactly what he was told. The defendant was arraigned and returned to the pen. The defendant stated he was all right after being asked how he felt by Sergeant Allison. At 12:15 p.m., the defendant was turned over to the Department of Corrections. Sergeant Allison stated that during the entire time the defendant was in his custody, he appeared to be alert. He looked around wherever he was. His answers to the questions were spontaneous. Attached herewith are all notes made by Sergeant Allison in connection with this defendant. So we have some notes here. Of course, they're terrible to try to read. It looks like a note that says, interviewed by ADA Queens Bronx shootings, Brooklyn ADA Aiello. They mentioned Sam Carr here. Knew Sam little over a year. Co-op City, 1 year. Stabbed 14-year-old outside in the street. So either while they were sitting in the conference room, Berkowitz brought up the Co-op City stabbing. Actually, when we put this in context, I'm sure that the officer just wrote that down as a note because he's got, spoke with ADA Quinn, spoke with ADA Aiello. So I'm sure he just heard that and jotted that down. And it was not while they were transporting him or babysitting him. All right, let's move on now to Captain Harold Coleman. September 16, 1977, Captain Harold Coleman, 10th Homicide Zone, telephone redacted. On August 10, 1977, Captain Coleman saw the defendant being taken to the Yonkers Police Department, escorted by 2 detectives and 1 other. At the Yonkers Police Department, the defendant was questioned by Detective Zigo, Detective Filotico, Inspector Dowd, Captain Coleman, and others for approximately 1 hour. So that checks in about right. They said 45 minutes and 5 minutes, about an hour. The questioning concerned the various homicides that occurred. The defendant was formally charged by the Yonkers Police Department for the crimes which took place in Yonkers. During the time the defendant was questioned, he was very open and answered all questions spontaneously. So everyone's got that magic word in there. After the defendant left the Yonkers Police Department, he was taken by Captain Coleman, Detective Zigo, Detective Filotico, and Sergeant Gardella to the New York Police Headquarters. In the car, there was general conversation, and the defendant made responses. At police headquarters, Captain Coleman had little direct contact with the defendant and saw the defendant again at central booking at the 84th Precinct. So that one was a quickie. This is another short one. This one's dated September 23rd, 1977, and this is prepared by Detective James Gallagher, Shield number 2430, 15th Homicide Zone, telephone redacted. On August 10th to 11th, 1977, he reported to the Chief of Detectives' office at the New York Police Department and saw the defendant on the 13th floor conference room. The defendant was being watched by 2 police officers. Detective Gallagher was present when the Assistant District Attorney questioned the defendant. Afterwards, he spoke to the defendant briefly. He found the defendant responsive to all questions, aware of what was going on. He thought about answers before answering. So, just to think a different use of words. He thought about it. I think he's just trying to say he was coherent. He knew where he was. Spontaneous kind of means like they're just kind of coming out. You know, the answers, he knows what they are because he did it, so they're coming out. Here he's saying that he thought about the answers before commenting, but I don't think he meant like he was, you know, lingering in his brain. He was coherent when he was answering. I'm thinking is what he meant there. Okay. That was another shorty. Let's see. September 15th, 1977. This is the account of Sergeant William Gardella, shield number 2738, 10th Homicide Zone, telephone redacted. On August 10th, 1977, Sergeant Gardella was outside 35 Pine Street when the defendant was taken into custody at about 10 p.m. The defendant was apprehended at his car while seated therein. The police officers identified themselves and the defendant stated, "Well, you got me." The defendant was quickly frisked and removed by car. He was quickly frisked and removed by car to the Yonkers Police Department. Sergeant Gardella stayed in front of 35 Pine Street. Okay. Sometime later, he drove the defendant from the Yonkers Police Department to the New York Police Department headquarters. Present in the vehicle was Captain Coleman, Detective Filotico, and Detective Zigo. Sergeant Gardella engaged in no conversation with the defendant. At police headquarters, the defendant was taken to the 13th floor and brought to the conference room. At this time, Sergeant Gardella left. No notes made. So they're just accounting for each and every one who was present and involved with the after effects of the arrest here. So far, I mean, we've got a little bit left, not too much more to go on this. So far, we see everyone being consistent, all of law enforcement being consistent, with David being coherent, knowing where he was, knowing what was going on. He was calm, he was cool and collective. You know, certainly not acting like a madman the way you would expect based on later articles and that sort of stuff. So, all right. We are on September 6, 1977. So I know there's a few a little bit out of order, but I don't think it makes a difference. Remember, each is the account of the respective law enforcement personnel. Okay, so this is Detective Charles Higgins, shield number 1189 of 10th Homicide Zone. Oh, telephone is there, 946-3303. On August 10th, 1977, Detective Higgins responded to 35 Pine Street with the 10th Homicide Zone. At approximately 10 p.m., the defendant was taken into custody. The defendant was then transported to the Yonkers Police Department. In the car with the defendant was Detective Higgins, Detective Filotico, and Craig Glassman is mentioned again. So I know that at one point there was a little bit of controversy that we knew Craig was there, but did he actually ride in the car with the cops and that sort of thing? Well, it appears he did. He took a ride from the time of the arrest just to transport him to YPD. As soon as the defendant entered the car with the above, he stated spontaneously, "How did you find me?" Detective Higgins advised the defendant of his Miranda warnings at this time. This was the first verbal contact he had with the defendant. The defendant was asked to reply after each warning, which he did. The defendant acknowledged yes to every right after being asked if he understood them. Detective Higgins then searched the defendant in the car and removed a quantity of .44 caliber bullets. The defendant assisted by nodding yes, and when asked if they were .44 calibers. The defendant was in Detective Higgins' company a total of 10 to 15 minutes. The defendant's demeanor was calm. And then there are some notes attached here. Okay, all this stuff we know. Here's a paragraph with just a little note on Chief Keenan. Chief Keenan looked at Berkowitz and asked, "What is your name, What is your name?" Berkowitz looked around at all the faces and smiling said, "I'm son of Sam." No one said anything, and at this time I asked Berkowitz, did he know who he was speaking to? He looked and smiled, and he said, "You're Detective Keenan," at which time Inspector Dowd said, "It's Chief Keenan." I've read that somewhere else before, too, in the police reports. But there's just a little account of Keenan. Any other notes here from Higgins? Approximately 0200 hours, Detective Longo driving Berkowitz's auto and myself driving department auto number 329, headed back to One Police Plaza. Arriving there, secured both autos in the garage and proceeded to the 13th floor. Okay, so they drove two other vehicles. And that's the end of Higgins' notes. Okay. October 3rd, 1977, Detective Marlon Hopkins, shield number 2217, 15th Homicide Zone, telephone redacted. Detective Hopkins responded to the Chief of Detectives office on August 11th, 1977 at about 2:30 a.m. The defendant was in the conference room on the 13th floor of the NYPD. After the various district attorneys questioned the defendant, Detective Hopkins asked him questions concerning the death of Christine Freund. No notes taken. The defendant responded to all questions. He appeared calm and coherent during the 1-hour interview. No other contact except this. So that's something I'll dig back in to the other police reports. Remember, these are the statements that they put together after the fact, and I just kind of going through them and skimming them with you. These last few are very short. September 9th, 1977, Detective John Longo, shield number 1711, 10th Homicide Zone, telephone redacted. Detective Longo responded to Westchester County on August 10th, 1977, with other detectives of the NYPD. He was assigned to the roof of, redacted, 35 Pine, or I don't know, he might have been a cross or something, but he was, the address is redacted, and he was assigned to the roof. He observed a commotion on the street and left his position with Detective Higgins. On the street, he observed the defendant in custody of the police officers. The defendant was removed by the Yonkers PD. Detective Longo had no direct contact with the defendant. He made notes of the above activity. Okay, I knew I had a thought. They talk about the arraignment process. Now, if you remember, before the data dump came out, that was one document that I was able to get my hands on, and we did that video in a live stream a couple months ago, and we went through the arraignment from start to finish. It wasn't very long, but I'll put the link in the video if anybody's interested, or if you want the arraignment papers, I can also provide those on the Facebook page. Okay, so we're only going to go into one here, and it's going to be the one of Craig Glassman, because all of law enforcement's reports, again, were repetitive because they're all telling basically the same story from a different angle. So of course you're going to have repetition if they're all, being straight with the same story. But I haven't read this one, and I thought it'd be cool. Let's go ahead and jump into Glassman's report. So September 6, 1977, Craig Glassman, everything's redacted. Mr. Glassman resides at the above address. He moved in by himself on March 15, 1977. He is separated and his wife lives at redacted. He never met David Berkowitz until August 10, 1977, when the New York Police Department took him into custody in the vicinity of 35 Pine Street. Earlier on August 10, 1977, he believes he may have seen Berkowitz bending over his car, which was parked on the street near, and it's redacted, so it's short, 35 Pine. Berkowitz's apartment was directly above Glassman's. Both apartments face out toward the vicinity of, and that's both redacted. It's pine and maybe wicker. And according to Glassman, you can see Warburton. According to Glassman, you can see Sam Carr's house from these windows. On June 7th, 1977, July 13th, 1977, and on August 6, 1977, Glassman received letters of a threatening nature. July 7th and 13th, he received one letter each time, and on August 6, 1977, he received two. These letters were sent to the Westchester County Sheriff's Department for analysis after each occasion. Attached herewith is the July 13th, 1977 letter. The other three will be subpoenaed. Glassman had no idea who sent the first two letters. On August 6, 1977, at about 7:30 a.m., Glassman heard a crackling sound outside his apartment door and observed a fire burning, which was in the frame of the door. In the fire, after it was extinguished, 15 to 20 .22 caliber bullets were found. The Yonkers Police Department responded. Officer Tom Chamberlain, Shield number 507, was informed and shown by Glassman all the letters he had received. Police Officer Chamberlain tells Glassman about Sam Carr and David Berkowitz. According to Glassman, Chamberlain informed him Berkowitz was a son of Sam suspect. Glassman never heard of Sam Carr until this moment. Glassman and Chamberlain tried to contact the defendant by knocking on his door, and there was no response. They also tried by using the fire escape to look in Berkowitz's windows, but they were covered with blankets. On this date, Glassman moved into, and it's redacted, I don't know if they're saying 35 Pine. It looks a little longer, so I don't know if he moved after that. But at this point, Glassman received a description of Berkowitz and his car from Police Officer Chamberlain. Between August 7th and 9th, 1977, Glassman returned daily to 35 Pine. On each day, he sees Berkowitz's car and observed a duffel bag and other contents in plain view after looking in, i.e. paper, jeans, blue ski jacket. As noted earlier in this report, on August 10, 1977, Glassman believes he saw Berkowitz near his car earlier in the day. At approximately 8 p.m. on August 10, 1977, Detectives Zigo and Filotico met Glassman as he exits at this point. Glassman believes these officers were from the Yonkers Police Department because of the notes and fire. At about 9:45, a male white exited 35 Pine Street and observed who was later identified as Berkowitz carrying a paper bag and entered the car Glassman knew as belonging to Berkowitz. Glassman is a member of the Westchester County Sheriff's Department and assisted the New York Police Department. At this point, while Berkowitz was behind the wheel of the car, ignition on, motor running, and officers identified themselves as police as they tell him to freeze, the defendant said spontaneously at this point, "You got me," and says something else. The defendant exits the car and then he is cuffed. There is no reaction or further statement at this time. Glassman, Detective Higgins, Detective Filotico, and Berkowitz go to the Yonkers Police Department. So there it is again. In the car, Detective Higgins advises Berkowitz of his Miranda warnings, and Berkowitz responded after each right. The defendant said nothing further. Glassman claims he asked Berkowitz about the letters and if he knew who he, Glassman, was. Berkowitz recognized Glassman and says, "You're Craig Glassman." No other conversation took place. At the Yonkers Police Department, Inspector Dowd and Berkowitz spoke. Glassman is not part of the conversation. Glassman returns with Higgins to 35 Pine, and when he comes back to the Yonkers Police Department, he sees Berkowitz leaving. Glassman states he was with Berkowitz a total time of 35 to 40 minutes. So that was consistent with what they said earlier. All right. I think we're going to pause it there. I think we've read the Glassman letter before, but, well, just in case you haven't heard it, I'll just go through that and then we'll finish up there. Starting to run on a little bit long here. Okay. My superior, Craig Glassman, Sergeant Glassman, I know how successful you have been with your assignment, forcing me out into the street for Mr. Carr. However, the dead are crying in their graves for justice, and God has promised it to them. I myself realize that I am beyond hope and redemption because I have succumbed to the powers of your commander, Mr. Carr. I obey all my orders, as you well know, and I carry them out dutifully. But we must face the fact that our deaths will come one day. Then there shall be the judgment. Since you are a fallen angel and have been condemned to the eternal fire before the earth was created, still God will be more merciful to you if you rebel against General Cosmo and his herd of demons. There is at this time little for you to gain by loyal service. I believe the end of the reign of terror is near, and the authorities will be dealing with you in their own way. I guess I'm foolish to plead with you to surrender and then to God, because I know that your soul is evil and that you have no heart. Therefore, you will have to spend eternity in the lowest depths of hell. Don't fear, because Captain Carr and his family and me will be at your side. Such a nut. You have done well in your 6,000 plus years of service. He's a vampire too. You have taken over my soul despite my early resistance and my denials and protests. Go ahead if you must and continue to torture the people of the earth. Don't stop issuing Captain Carr's wrath upon the world at my pleas. Just go ahead, you cruel monster, and continue your torments. You will stand naked at the judgment seat of Christ. Your brother, Desmuts. I don't know much about religion, so I'm not sure what that is, but so there's one of the letters, and this one, let me see if the date's on it. It's not, but I have a feeling that this is that August one closest to the arrest. That would make sense. All right. So that was a lot. We got through almost 30 pages of this 61-page document. So again, repetitive. I don't know if it feels a little boring for you, but my feeling is I've got to read it. Maybe you want to read it but don't have time, or whatever. So maybe listening and kind of reading, going through it together may help you get through it. So I'm going to look at the rest of this. I'm not going to do it on air, but I will highlight what I feel is interesting. And I think for the remainder of this document, I will summarize and either add a short to it, or if there's a lot of information, come back on and do another part. So I hope that was interesting for you. I am so excited that you joined me. Of course, this is premiere, so hopefully we're chatting it up. And that's all I got, folks. Have a great night. I'll give you a proper outro, but before the outro comes on, don't leave, because just one more time, I'm going to give you the condensed version of the Timeline Task Force video. And again, that's going to be out in just a few days, the slideshow, and then the remainder of the toolbox will be out in the next few weeks. We're just really cleaning things up, making sure links work, and just really getting it as perfect a prototype as we can. So, all right, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Enjoy the video, and I will see you on the next Cracklin' Rosie True Crime. Thank you so much, guys. In true crime cases, There are two imperative tasks done by law enforcement in order to organize and ultimately arrest those responsible for committing the crime or crimes. One is preparing a list of suspects. The other, constructing a timeline of events. I am so excited to present to you the Son of Sam Timeline Task Force.